Hello and welcome to One Parliamentary Language Political Podcast comes to you from the same country that brought you the Royal Wedding. How are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very good, having just celebrated my birthday with a lot of cocktails.
Yay, happy birthday.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm cocktail here now, so hopefully the recording won't go too downhill.
No, that's fine. I mean, isn't now the perfect place to plug your other podcast on cocktail?
Oh, that's true, yes. I do have another podcast called Dr. Wilco's Campaign for Better Beverages, where I make a cocktail on a roughly weekly basis, and also occasionally review places. I probably didn't spend long enough at anywhere to actually review them weekend, but tried a lot of different cocktail bars. It was good. So now we'll move on to Headline Quickfire. So our first one's from the Independent. End of the line, all change, please.
Yeah, I think you know a little bit more about this than I do, but the rough, the gist of this story is that the East Coast Main Line, is that right? That Virgin Media was in control of the past so many years, finally going to be handed back into government control. So another sort of like turning back the clock from the old Thatcher policies of privatising the railways. This is one that's gone the other way and will become a nationalised service again.
Yeah, so it's been renamed back to its old name of London North Eastern Railway, so LNER. And I think the reason is, as you say, this was a story. It was a nationally owned railway that was doing fine, and then it got privatised. And under the privatisation, people have complained about various things. And there's been, I think, about 2 years ago, there were claims that Virgin was kind of cheating to get its place back. And there's been I don't know, remember the exact details on that, but there was definitely some scandal around how they got the new contract, or it may have gone to someone else and then back to them. But there's been problems, and now it has been taken back. So as of 24th of June this year, the East Coast Main Line will be back to LNER, and I think that's resurrecting the name that was in the 1920s.
Yeah,
but it is, as you say, it's kind of a big story. It was privatised. It's failed as privatised when it's been privatised. Now it's coming back as a nationally owned railway, and all the tickets and everything are going to be honoured. So as far as travellers are concerned, it's exactly as it was before. But yeah, it is kind of a knock to that concept of privatisation is always better.
Yeah, I think there was a general concern over rail prices, that they were just going up and up, and that we'd never see them going down again. And the whole point of privatisation is it's meant to, in theory, bring prices down because everybody's meant to be more competitive. That simply wasn't happening. So I think this will be like used as a test case for those who want to use it. You know, the success of the nationalisation, if it can be sort of spread out to other rail networks in the country, and if it's a success, yeah, we'll see how it goes. But it's certainly one that sort of like Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party have wanted to renationalise the railways in some way. So it'll be a good test of what happens here.
As you say, the prices there's a lot of problem where with the privatisation, the money raised is being used to subsidise railway lines in other countries because the private owners of the companies are not necessarily British. And I think that's a problem as well. So, like, for example, I think it's the Dutch railway service. The Dutch railway is subsidised by our railways, and people are not happy about that. So that's another reason for deprivatising the sector, I think. Right, next up from the Times, hundreds more troops planned for Afghanistan.
Yeah, this is the news that the Defence Secretary, Gavin Williamson, you might remember him as the weird-looking guy who has a tarantula in his office called Kratos. He used to scare his ministers. And also recently he told Russia to shut up and go away. Which
yes, I think we discussed that at length.
Yeah. Which is one of the less threatening things a foreign secretary has done. A defence secretary has done. Yes, he's recommended that the UK sends up to about 400 more army personnel into Afghanistan, joining about the 600 already there. So that would make 1,000 in total. To try and just keep training troops and ensure that the security of Afghanistan continues.
And was there some pressure from the US there?
It's a little. I mean, I think the US has been, when Donald Trump came in as president, he was first keen to get out of Afghanistan and then did a U-turn on that matter. And now Donald Trump has asked NATO and other allies to send more troops to the country. So it seems to be a direct reply from the USA.
Right, okay. And our next headline, one that I think has been pretty hard to avoid for the last few months, Harry Ever After, from the Mail on Sunday.
Yes, this wonderful pun comes to courtesy of the Royal Wedding. It's happened. It's finally over. I must admit, I didn't watch the ceremony. I assume you were out cocktailing, Wilco, so you didn't see any of it either.
And no, I saw absolutely nothing of it. The only thing I've seen today is a post about all the things Meghan Markle can no longer do because she's now a member of the royal family.
Oh, it just sounds sad.
I mean, it's some of the stuff is obvious. Like she can't really go anywhere on her own anymore because she has to have a security escort and things like that. But yeah, it's interesting. I think it is a more modern wedding. They changed some things up. I've seen on Facebook some friends of mine are very, very happy that it's happening because it's kind of this idea that someone of mixed heritage is finally coming into this very white institution and has been accepted. So I think that's important for a lot of people, especially kind of in the wake of Windrush and stuff. People are kind of very hot on anything around that, and so the fact that they had a gospel choir and an Episcopal preacher from the US and stuff like that, I think it's not a government thing, but a lot of people are happy that that's happened, and that's very good. And yeah, it seems like the royal family has tried to move with the times a bit. I mean, they're still the royal family, they're still this kind of old institution, but I think a lot of people were very happy with how it all turned out, so that's good. But as I say, I didn't really watch the coverage myself, so I don't know too much about it.
No, I've got the same as you, really. Those new features that were added were sort of proof that the royal family can change, and I think particularly if you look back a generation to the Queen's, to her sons and daughters, their weddings all sort of went a very different way. There was the sort of intimation that Charles maybe didn't marry Diana for love. It was more of an arranged marriage, and then he's finally been able to get together with Camilla at a later date. The weddings of, I think, William and Harry have been very much there. They've learned from the mistakes of the past, and they've said, no, we've got to move forward with the time. We've got to modernise, or we run the risk of becoming an outdated institution. So yeah, it's really lovely to see them embrace a different side of things. And yeah, I wish all the best and happy couple.
And I think while we're on this topic, just to, as I say, it's been hard to miss it the last few days, but we get some of our best puns from this. As I say, this one was Harry Ever After, which I thought was quite good. There's also the Sun and the Daily Star had the same one, which is Kiss Story, which is not great. And then I think Harry Inglorious from the Sunday Mirror is quite good. A photo of him with a very cheesy grin, which is quite funny. Yeah, so I enjoy from the Sun on Saturday. I'm getting harried in the morning with a very happy looking photo of Meghan Markle. So that's quite funny. It is nice to see all this kind of stuff being a bit modernised, and also the fact that, as you say, it's like it's something nice that's happened in the news for once. Yes. I think a lot of people are like, "Ooh, that's nice," even if they don't really care that much. I mean, there's loads of Union Jacks up all over London and stuff, and there was just kind of the mood seemed a bit different yesterday, even though thankfully the wedding was happening outside of London and didn't affect my birthday plans. And so our final headline, moving on into our main story tonight: Ireland says UK must keep single market ties, from the Daily Telegraph.
So this is one that will move into our big story, but it's the idea, and it's one that's come along time and time again. It's the problem of the UK leaving the European Union and essentially trying to do that whilst avoiding a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. It's something that was addressed during the Brexit campaign, but nobody really came up with an answer for it. And now that Brexit's happening, we're sort of being forced to find an answer. And our deep dive tonight's going to go into like the various different options that the government is considering and how realistic those are.
So, with that said, what are the options that are available?
So there's two options that are being discussed, at least by the government. So just to be clear, there are more options than this on the table. Like in the world, like there are lots of different options we could do, but the government has narrowed it down to two that they believe are feasible. We've got the customs partnership, which is Theresa May's preferred option, and we've got maximum facilitation, or MaxFac, that's being shortened to. And that's the Brexiteers' preferred option. As
you say, there's two main options being discussed at the moment. And what's the government, Theresa May's kind of preferred option, which is the customs partnership? How does that work?
So this is the idea that so the UK will be out of the customs union, which we sort of discussed in the past, but being in the customs union means that you've got to agree to a whole load of other EU regulations and sort of agree to the four freedoms, one of which is freedom of migration. So to avoid that, we enter into a customs partnership instead. So in this, the UK does the job of the EU on customs. So any goods that come through the UK on their way to another EU country gets a tariff applied to them, and then we bundle that money together and send it off to the EU at a later date. So there's a couple of reasons why Theresa May sort of like prefers this option. It's a bit cleaner. There's sort of it's cleaner. So what I mean by that is that it may be able to avoid the hard border with Ireland. So you wouldn't have to have big checkpoints set up at the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, which would avoid some of the controversy that would go on with that situation. Just to quickly go into that, Northern Ireland and the troubles that have happened there through the 1970s and 1980s, and then the peace agreement that came through in 1998, I think, was the Good Friday Agreement. Since then, we've had relatively few troubles in Northern Ireland, but there's a worry that it could all boil up again if a hard border was put on there, particularly when you've got nearly all of the constituencies on the border. They have Sinn Féin as their elected MP for that county. So it's clear that, Sinn Féin, who support the reunification of Ireland, essentially, they want Northern Ireland to have closer ties with Ireland. They would be very upset by a hard border or a wall in between the two countries. So Theresa May is using this customs partnership to try and avoid that from happening.
I think it's probably worth mentioning for any non-British listeners that there's Ireland, which is a physical island, and then on that there is Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom and of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and then the southern part is the Republic of Ireland, which has the euro as part of the EU, and that's currently how it is. But obviously, with the free movement of people, that as you say, the border, people can just cross over. There's no problem.
And so for Brexiteers and for Brexit, the issue with Northern Ireland is that it shares a land border with another EU country. If the United Kingdom, or that island as you imagine it, just wanted to leave, that would be fairly simple because we've got a natural, border of water that stops people coming in and us not knowing about it. Essentially, you don't need to have a horrible wall. You just have control at ports. With Northern Ireland, the situation would be very different. And because you've got small businesses and people who move over that border on a daily basis to get things done, any sort of hard border control would be problematic, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, it's for people who are living on the border and commuting over. It's all the same problems that you get. It's all the same kind of problems we've seen whenever this kind of issue has happened before. So, like with the crackdown in the US on the kind of the Mexican border, there are people who need to cross the border for their jobs. And but there are examples of where this has gone horribly wrong before. I mean, obviously, the worst case is probably the Berlin Wall, where people literally put down a wall overnight and cut people off. No one's really proposing that, but it's still, it's still, we can see the problems that could occur because this has happened before elsewhere.
Yeah, we very do. So I think just to add to that, so looking back at this customs partnership, so the good is that it might avoid that hard border, but the bad is that you'd still have to have some sort of quite soft border set up. You'd still have to have some checks on goods that are going through, and that might cause some upset. Thing is that the UK would, in this option, we'd still be free to negotiate our own trade deals with other countries, so they wouldn't be affected by the EU rules and regulations. So the reason why Theresa May has always said that she wants to leave the customs union in general is because it means that all goods that came in from anywhere in the world just to the UK would be subject to EU customs. Now, in this one, it would only be goods that are going through the UK on their way on to another EU nation that would be affected. However, if we do that, then we'd still be giving some money to Brussels. We'd still be giving the EU their share, and that might upset some very hard Brexiteers who wouldn't want to give Brussels anything as possible. Yeah, my final point would be that this has never been done before, so it's a bit pie in the sky. We don't quite know how it would work. It would take years to set up the infrastructure, and because there's no sort of example of how it's worked in the past, then it sort of like remains an option that the EU could easily dismiss at the negotiation table.
Right. Yeah. So with that all in mind, what's option 2? How does max FAC? I mean, that is an awful short name. So maximum facilitation, or apparently some kind of eyeliner brand, max FAC. How does that work? This is, as you say, this is a Brexiteer's preferred option.
Yeah. So in this version, it aims to sort of remove the need for a physical customs check wherever possible. It's meant to sort of like create a frictionless, fluid border. And the way they do that is that they employ sort of new technologies, automation to streamline procedures, and try and like make sure that goods are sort of like scanned through a machine even before they get to the UK, and then we know where they're going. So you don't have to have this sort of like hard infrastructure of ports and stuff to do it. It will all happen away from the UK, I believe, is the idea. It would build on existing schemes and sort of like help the UK interact with the rest of the help the UK and the EU interact with the rest of the world easier. So the big plus of this is, again, that you don't get that super hard border. You get a sort of like much softer border. It's a much cleaner break from the EU as well. You're not still sending money on to the EU. You are just sort of like, you're doing it all yourself. And it gives us a lot more freedom, and it's a much cleaner break. However, sort of like the bad side of this, and if I've been vague in my description, it's because the government has been equally vague in their explanation of how this is going to work. I get the feeling with this option that the government's just sort of like, technology will deal with it. It's fine. Technology will work the customs out for you, and hasn't really explained how it's going to work yet. And that technology might take years to come together and to implement as well. So yeah, it still leaves us with some of the same problems as the first option does.
Yeah, I mean, technology is so vague. Do they mean? Do they mean some kind of software solution that allows us to manage everything coming in, or do they mean like different scanners? You know, if there's technology, could be anything really.
Yeah, it's really, that one's really unclear. It seems to be sort of like the more attractive option if somebody, sort of threw it to you, particularly from a Brexiteer's perspective, because it gives them more freedom to do more sort of like trade deals, and is like, I think, I mentioned before that it seems to be you're breaking from the EU far cleaner, and it's a bigger win for like the Brexit side of the argument. But how you implement that is much, much cloudier. The big downside.
And surely, of course, we still need a border for that to work. So it doesn't remove that problem.
No, it tries to lessen the border issue as much as possible, but yeah, it doesn't remove it entirely. So we've still got that hanging over us.
So we haven't got very long now. We've got less than a year until we officially leave. How likely do you think either of these, if whatever one we agree to, is actually going to be achieved in that short period of time?
It's not looking good in the short term, I would say. So one of the biggest problems that we haven't discussed yet is that Northern Ireland has sort of like, Theresa May would like Northern Ireland to have different rules to the rest of the UK when it comes to customs agreements, because essentially you've got lots of, as we mentioned, we've got small traders who are working there and carry out like the majority of their transactions across the border. Theresa May's already said that she wants the EU to allow those to have like special exemption from some customs. But the EU is like, they don't really want to get on board with that because they see that as a potential for people to smuggle things over a border that's not, that isn't managed. If I was to say to any country, I was to like offer you a deal to any country and say, do a trade deal with us. All our borders are secure. Apart from that one over there, we're not really sure what goes through that one, but don't worry about it. It's only little, like that's kind of the deal we're offering to the EU. So it's likely that the EU is going to reject it. And then on Theresa May's side, her parliamentary partners, the DUP, they're the reason why Theresa May is pushing so hard for Northern Ireland to have an exemption, because the DUP thinks it's essential that they have these special rules so Northern Ireland can keep being an independent nation. So again, we have that problem of the 2017 election where Theresa May failed to secure a massive majority. She probably wouldn't be able to get either of these customs unions agreements through the Houses of Parliament because the DUP would refuse to go along with it, and then she'd lose the majority.
So on that point, how is her cabinet seeing the issue? Because presumably there's a split there, as we've discussed before. She's had to try and she's had to manage like people who are loyal to her, and also have a few Brexiteers in there to ensure so that the party doesn't split essentially around her. So with the cabinet being made up of a mix of people, how are they voting on this at the moment?
So they're pretty much split down the middle, 50-50. So before, when Theresa May had Amber Rudd in the cabinet, Rudd was a staunch Remainer, and she would have supported Theresa May's plan of a customs union, and the cabinet would be split 6-6, 50-50 down the middle, and May would have the casting vote. Now that Sajid Javid has replaced Amber Rudd after the Windrush scandal, the cabinet is split 6-5 in favour of Max Fack. And apparently some in government, or at least according to a Laura Kuensberg I was reading earlier, there's some suspicions that Theresa May meant to put in Justice Minister David Gauke as a Remainer into her cabinet to make sure the vote would be 50-50. But during the Windrush scandal and all of that, he may have just been missed off the list. And this is why the vote has gone against her, which would be a little unfortunate, given everything that's gone on, and not quite the way to run an efficient cabinet. Those sort of like unsubstantiated rumours as they go, but I wouldn't put it past her not to forget to put somebody in who might support her. But the end result for May is that with the 6-5 vote, May says, okay, we've got to do both research into both methods to see which one's more feasible. Then we'll come back and vote on it again. The big problem with this is that the March 2019 deadline is approaching. If you think when we decided to leave the EU and how long it's got us so far, and we haven't even agreed how we're going to deal with our economic dealings between the EU at this stage, to just keep pushing it back, trying to leave it to the last minute until March 19 when we need to leave the European Union. It just means that time is just another factor that's not on Theresa May's side.
Yeah, and I think this has always been the problem. We've mentioned it in previous episodes. I know I've mentioned it in day to day in real life. 2 years was never enough time to sort all this out, and it's fast approaching. No one really knows what's going to happen, and I think often the problem is we're going to end up picking not the best choice. That doesn't mean we're picking the worst choice. Hopefully, I'd like to think, given all the available information, we try to pick the best choice. But there's so much politics going on, and so on and so forth, that we are going to we're going to be having to pick suboptimal options when it comes to it, because there will be a point where we have to be like, we need a decision now, because it takes us 8 months to get ready for any of them or whatever, So that is one of my biggest concerns at the moment about what's going to happen.
Yeah, you're right to have that concern at the moment. I feel I hope I really hope it sorts itself out and that the best option is found, because we do need a solution to this problem. If we don't find it out, then the results might be catastrophic economically. So I imagine some compromise will have to be made.
And so now a quick polls update. So last time we were talking about the local elections. As we say, that was probably one of the best polls you can do, actually having an election. But the polls still happen every week. So how's it looking at the moment?
Well, the results for early in May still look quite good for the Conservatives. So we've got the big three groups who've released polls, Salvation, ICM and YouGov, all of which give the Conservatives a lead. YouGov has Conservatives on the biggest lead of +5, while Salvation has them just on +1, which probably puts the ICM poll, which puts the Conservatives at +3, probably about right for where we are, given that polls can be there's sort of like a margin of error on them of 2-3%.
The one thing I find interesting here is that that's the result just after those local elections, where it was very close over the national vote. Almost neck and neck between Conservatives and Labour.
Yeah, I'm quite surprised by those results. I don't think it's been a particularly good time for the government after the local elections. And on the flip side, I don't think it's been a particularly bad time for Labour, who had, as we said, they may have had some trouble with expectations management before the local elections, but those results were still really good. They still made gains in place, that they should have done. So yeah, I'm a little perplexed by that. It might just be a reaffirmation of what we said last week, that two party politics is sort of here to stay. The big two parties have sort of got themselves into a stalemate. 43-40, which was the ICM poll, which I think was probably the most accurate. It's not an insurmountable lead for the Conservatives or Labour. And if it was in that 3% margin of error, then you'd have the Conservatives and Labour pretty much 50-50 there as well. So it's still anybody's game, but I do think it's interesting, since about Labour had a small lead at the start of 2017, and to see the Conservatives take that back as the year goes on is interesting, because I haven't really felt that big momentum swing in my personal life, or just how things are going in general. I don't think the mood of the country really reflects that.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, it's always hard to draw that kind of conclusion, because you hang out with certain people with a certain mindset.
Yeah.
Especially in my central London office, I think we're quite firmly in one camp, or at least for the most part. You don't get people coming in and being like, "Oh, I think the government is doing a great job about this Brexit thing," especially in a German-owned office. But yeah, it is interesting. It doesn't seem like it is quite aligned with what we saw a few weeks ago. And I think, 29th of April, there was a tie from Comres, and that's probably, but then, the YouGov ones right afterwards show Conservatives leading. So, I know there were some more kind of Labour council seats up for election. So maybe that's part of the problem with that local election, is that there were slightly more Labour seats up for election, and so it is slightly skewed that way. But it is interesting that it seems to have this slight swing towards Conservatives at the moment, given where everything's going.
It might just be it's been a bit of a sort of slow few weeks news wise. I think if you consider it with the big Windrush scandal that Conservatives had, which was quite disastrous for their image, and compare that with now it's all calmed down a bit and we sort of returns to status quo, that sort of feeling tends to benefit the party in power the most, because people feel like, okay, who's in charge and I'm okay, all right, then they must be doing a good job. If you're not paying that much attention, that's sort of that's how polling goes. If headlines are dominated by the government's doing a bad job, then that's when it's more likely to favour the opposition. So it might just be that sort of calm, or sort of late, slow news weeks that we've had.
So sadly, it's a slightly boring 2 weeks it's been, but there'll always be some more politics to talk about next time. Yeah. So I can't believe there won't be a scandal in the next 2 weeks, given how it's been the last year.
There's enough going on, or if that fails, and I can always look over to America, which has its fair amount of politics going on.
And so now on to our regular segment. Would you rather?
So my question to you this week, I think we mentioned it in our last issue, where there was the Daily Mail headline, House of Unelected Wreckers, which seems to suggest that there's this sort of new demand, at least amongst Brexiteers, for unelected House of Lords. So my question to you is, would you rather have a fully elected upper chamber in UK politics, or would you rather keep the status quo as it is?
So I think the short answer is yes. I think an elected upper chamber is more representative. But the question, I think, is about how to do that. So the way the House of Lords works, as we mentioned then, is that they're kind of a checks and balances on what's going on with the Houses of Parliament. So the thing I always wonder about I know that in general, from a representation point of view, I want an elected upper chamber, but the question is, how does there need to be some kind of initial vetting maybe on those candidates? Like, they need to have a certain amount of experience, because then it's a different pool of people, but there's still a vote on who that person is. And I think there is definitely a problem with the it's a very weird system. We'll go into this before, but we not only do we have the Lords temporal, which are people who are lords. We have the Lords spiritual, which is a selection of bishops. And we used to have, but they're now essentially our Supreme Court. We used to have the judges. I can't remember what their term was. Were they the Lords Judicial, probably.
Yeah, I think it was something along those lines. But yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
The judiciary had a part of the Lords, sort of like guaranteed that they would have.
So and the way it works at the moment, so it used to be entirely based on who you were when you were born. The peerages were just they were all hereditary, and then at some point we've switched. I can't remember when we first started having the Lords chosen by the current government, but I think it was around 2000 that we had a big bit of reform, and we basically chucked out a load of the hereditary peers. I mean, lots of them didn't turn up, and also, that there were people who shouldn't really have had that position, just got it because of who their dad was. So I agree with all of that change. The question, I think, now moving forwards is how do we work that out? Because I know in America they have the senators and they have the House. Senators, House of Representatives.
So you've got representatives in the House of Representatives, and you've got senators in the Senate.
In the Senate. So Congress is the Senate, yes.
Congress
is the House. This is the thing. I'm not so hard with terminology.
Yeah.
So
I think so. You've got the House of Representatives, which is your lower chamber, and you've got the Senate, which is your upper chamber. And I think I'm going to be proved wrong. I'm going to look it up. I think Congress is like the whole thing.
Right. Okay.
It's like the legislative branch.
So Congress is like saying Parliament.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
cool. That's fine.
Both. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have two houses of Parliament. Okay. Yes, that makes sense. So the impression I get from the US is that being a senator is kind of it's more of a big deal, because you have to be you have to have more experience, right? I don't actually know how they choose the candidates. I mean, obviously the big parties are choosing their preferred candidate through their primaries and so on, primaries and secondaries. But I don't know if there are like some minimum requirements. I don't know if you have to be older, for example, to be in the Senate. So I think looking over to how the US does it from those points of view is probably a good thing, just to see how it's set up in another country. And I think they're probably, because it's kind of as we say, it's like checks and balances. It's people who are going to be investigating, looking at what's actually written down when people try and pass laws and being like, you should rewrite this. So I think a tendency for people to have some kind of minimum bar of experience is useful, but I don't know where we draw that line. I think that's the big problem for me for switching over now. Right now, the system I think could be improved, but I don't know exactly how we would change it. I definitely think it would be better than the current system, where basically whoever's in power is just putting their mates in. I mean, even though those mates tend to be, respected people in their various fields, that they're often lawyers, etc., and that is very helpful. It does mean there's this kind of, and it also means there is a benefit that. So one benefit from that system is that the people in the House of Lords tend to be weighted towards who was in government previously. So if one government stays in for a long time, then you might get a problem. But it does mean at the moment there's a lot more like Lib Dems and Labour in the House of Lords, and the Conservatives are adding more whenever they get the opportunity, which means it will slowly move to being Conservative. But then when we have a Labour government or a coalition of some kind after the Tories lose power, that means they're being checked by the opposite party. And in general, I think that is a good way to do it, instead of it having being all completely one way. So they might be... Then you could see why a party might choose not to double check as hard. You know what I mean? But while I'm generally for it, I don't know how. I haven't thought hard enough about how I'd like to see it redone. I think we'd need to, if reform was happening, we'd need to have like the government come up and be like, here are the options we're suggesting, and then we'd have to have a discussion about it then.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like, I think, like, in principle, the House of Lords is in desperate need of reform and needs to be more representative, and you'd rather have elected than appointed. But also, I'm really aware of the important job it does to check and balance the power of the current government, whoever's in charge, because if you have a situation where one party wins big and has lots of people in both the Houses of Parliament and the Houses of Lords, then there is the worry that they could let any piece of legislation go through and not really check it or not really do the proper stuff on it. So if the House of Parliament committee system was more thorough then, and they had a better chance to check it at both stages, or, something would need to be put in place to make sure that those checks and balances are still happening at some stage, to make sure that no one party or no one person can have too much. I think that's my that's my one concern about upper chamber reform. But yeah, it needs to. I can't point to another political system that exists in the world where they have this sort of like, oh, we kind of appoint people to our upper chamber of parliament, but they're not really elected, and who like you can look at any other like France, Germany, the USA, all of them have got they've got upper chambers, but they are accountable to somebody. The Lords aren't really to the same extent.
I mean, I think hopefully this argument works for a broad audience. But as an example of why it's a bit weird, Andrew Lloyd Webber, the guy who wrote all of those musicals like Cats and Phantom of the Opera, he is a Lord, and so he gets to vote on these things, even though he's not really been involved in the legislature for his entire life, or even for a significant portion of it. I mean, he writes musicals, and I feel that's the kind of like. That's kind of the crux of the argument. Does someone with that experience, should they be able to go and vote on things? It turns out he doesn't really vote very often. I think he turned up to vote for Brexit once because he lives in the US. Voted for one of the Brexit-based ones, and that's it. So he's not really having a major effect. But the point is, like, someone should be there all the time. Like, if we had them held to account by being voted on, then they would see it as a full-time job in the same way that the houses, the lower chamber is, with our MPs. So I think that's the important thing there. The fact that someone can basically never turn up and kind of decide to turn up to swing a particular vote is not great. In general, MPs do turn up to vote. There's still an issue with MPs voting on things, but in general, I feel they actually turn up most of the time because it is their full-time job.
Yeah, I think this might be like a good topic for one of our summer episodes as well, because I've got
I've got
a million different like options and things going on in my brain at the moment. Like the conversation could go on for like way too long. So yeah, we need to dive into a later date.
Yes, definitely. We'll leave it there for today. I think this might have been a slightly shorter episode than we normally manage. But yes, as you say, it's been a slightly slow 2 weeks. Is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
No, that's it. I don't want to say sort of fingers crossed that something happens in the next 2 weeks. We are like slowly edging our way towards, we've mentioned it, silly season, to like the winding down of Parliament. So, it might be that the next 2 weeks is a little slow, but if a week's a long time in politics, then 2 weeks is an age. So fingers crossed something happens.
Yes. So as always, you can find us at tinkertailorsoldersponge.com/unparliamentary. You can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. You can find us on Twitter at unparlpodcast. And if you want to support the show, give us some money towards a new microphone for Rob and generally keeping the website running. That's over at patreon.com/TTSS. And we'll see you in 2 weeks. So it's goodbye from me.
It's goodbye from him. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.